You go right on ahead.
Okay, well, let's get started.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Dixon Jr., and I am one of the gallery assistants at Kinfolk House. And I would like to just warmly welcome you all to tonight's event. I would like to tell you before we get started that tonight's event is being recorded, and we do plan on using this recording on all of our social media platforms. So if you would like to show your face may be featured on Instagram or Facebook or whatnot. But yeah, let's get started. So tonight's event is called Telling Our Stories, and we are so excited to have kinfolk artist Jenelle Esparza with us. During tonight's virtual event, um, Jenelle will lead a discussion on the importance of oral histories and how we keep our family narratives alive across generations. Before I pass the baton over to Jenelle, I do want to give a brief bio, and then we're going to dive right into the event. So let's get started. Okay, so Jenelle Esparza is an interdisciplinary artist who was born in the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas. She attended the University of Texas at San Antonio and received her BFA in photography in 2010. She currently lives and works in San Antonio. Esparza examines the lesser known history of cotton and labor in South Texas through photography and textiles and incorporates concepts of body movement, history, gender, identity, culture, and race. She has shown her work in several galleries and art spaces throughout the US and has been a recipient of many prestigious awards. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Jenelle Esparza.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that awesome, really lovely, wonderful intro. That made me feel really good. Thank you so much. And I'm excited. Thank you guys for joining again. I'm excited about this little discussion. It's kind of the first time that I've done something like this, but because my work is so research-based, I thought, why not? Let's try it out. And I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, but I think the distance is a bit too long for me to be there. And so I appreciate y'all logging on virtually. And I hope that it's a little convenient. So I thought, that we would first maybe spend a few minutes discussing the two readings that I had provided. And if you weren't able to read them, that's totally fine too. We can just, I can just kind of describe some of the themes and we can kind of talk about it. So I think that each of the readings, one of them was from a book authored by Monica Muñoz Martinez, who's a historian in South Texas. I believe she's based in Austin. And she wrote a book called The Injustice Never Leaves You. And while the book is about themes of like state sanctioned violence against ethnic Mexicans in the border in the early 20th century, she has a really heavy kind of importance. She stresses the importance of oral histories in these types of documents and in these types of histories so that people of color can carry their histories, their personal narratives that may not have been included in any official documents through generations, and kind of like how impactful that is on generations of families and communities to kind of know who we are, where we came from. I don't know if anyone's ever watched that PBS show called Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. I love that show. I love it so much. I just think it's so fascinating. And I think the guests themselves probably, will definitely have emotional responses because of how fascinating the truth of their past is. And so I was hoping that we could also, after discussing a little bit about the readings, like get into our own stories and our own kind of sharing circle. And maybe you have some family narratives that you've learned about through a relative, or some discoveries that you may have come upon in your adult life about your ancestry or your generational past or something like that that might have been insightful. Yeah, I think I'll just get into it. If anyone was able to read a couple of the things, like I said, the first one was Monica Muñoz Martinez's book, and it was really a piece of the intro. I didn't even get into like the chapters of the book because again, I wanted to just kind of pinpoint the the stress that she puts on the oral history and how she did her research for that book, which was both official archives and visiting with families and these sort of amateur archivists, if you will. These people, just everyday folks who learned a bit about their past and saw this connection to this story that they never knew about, and spent a good chunk of their lives researching it, interviewing family members, and collecting all of these stories and sort of preserving them over time. And it's like the families took that upon themselves to do that, you know, even if the histories are you know, really painful, you know. And the second reading is a study by 3 people. There's Michelle Caswell, PhD, Marika Sifar, and Mario H. Ramirez. They all kind of co-produced this study that was published by UCLA, and they're talking about South Asian American digital archive and kind of trying to measure the impact of that on the South Asian American community. Again, it's a little on the academic side, but I was hoping that we could, I kind of pulled together as much as I could. Well, I actually, as little as I could, so that you weren't having to read like an entire book, but you could just read a couple pages and maybe get the gist of it.
So Anna has a comment in the chat and says, I want to say that I read the Caswell Ramirez study back in library school.
Oh, that's amazing, Anna. That's awesome. I didn't even know that it was like a well-known document like that, but I mean, I found it, it was actually cited in an article that I read by ESPN, which is a weird source, but the author of the ESPN article was like putting links in the text to their site, to their sources, which I thought was really cool too. And I came upon it that way, and I was like, this is great. This is really wonderful. So I'm so glad you already had that intro.
Yeah, and I know Michelle Caswell in particular, she's a really big proponent for community-based archives and oral histories and whatnot. And I don't remember exactly where I was introduced to SADA, like the South Asian Archive, but I think it might have been like an archivist convention a few years back, and I was really impressed by this basically volunteer effort to basically preserve people's memories from the ground up, and it not being kind of centralized at an institution. I thought that was really cool.
I agree. Yeah. And I can totally see this all from like the fascination from an archivist perspective and a historian's perspective. I find it fascinating from an artist's perspective, just because I'm just fascinated, I think, by the efforts that human beings will go through to preserve stories like these for future generations. So Monica talks about, she calls this like vernacular history making. And there's another term that Michelle Caswell goes through called symbolic annihilation, which is like where groups are misrepresented or ignored in mainstream medias. And I'm just fascinated at like the resistance to that, you know. There's oftentimes, even looking through genealogical records or census records of past relatives, I'm like, I can definitely identify all the names listed on this document, but they're like misspelled, or I just kind of stumble upon things because of things like misspellings, or just kind of a brushing over of details and stuff like that, you know. So I have family kind of correcting me. You know?
Yeah, that's interesting. In my own family research, I found a lot of the same kind of thing, a lot of misspellings of names across the board, from like immigration records to birth certificates and death certificates. And I found out through like my research that my grandmother actually had her name like completely misspelled, and her mother's name misspelled on her birth certificate, probably until she was like in her 20s or 30s, and she had to like go and get it redone and corrected. It's
Yeah,
just so bizarre to think about, yeah, things like our identities being so distorted by like government agencies.
exactly. And there are like handwritten documents too. So there's the human error, like someone's bad handwriting or a misspelling. I know my grandma's like official birth date was incorrect. It was recorded like 2 days before or after her actual day of her birth. So that's kind of common too in these like official records from a particular era, you know. Anna says it speaks to the fallibility of written record when someone tends to point to those as authoritative and the truth. Exactly. And I think that both of these authors, all of these scholars point to that exact conclusion. I highlighted a few things here where Monica Muñoz Martinez says that survivors of state terror pass critical memories that challenge mainstream histories along to the next generation. And she's talking again about a history of violence in the state of Texas, and how that pain is never really resolved without an acknowledgement. And so that's really what kind of where the resistance kind of came from these families when they learned of their families that they are descendants of that. It's like that pain is kind of like there, but you didn't know why, or it's there's like a all of a sudden like this need to preserve it and to have it acknowledged. And I think that that's also important, and I think that's also a little bit why I find these histories in Texas particularly really interesting, because through genealogical records, I found my family must have been here during the time that all this violence was occurring in the same small region of Texas. So there's bound to be some connection there. If we didn't experience it maybe directly, I think even just living in the area and being of the same ethnicity that all this violence was occurring is part of it in a way. And then again, like this, just the sheer not knowing about it is sort of like, you know, it needs to be said, it needs to be shared, and then healing can begin from that. And there's countless communities throughout the United States that have gone through the same thing, and yeah, it's important. It's important to kind of study all of these things.
You know, another thing to think about is, you know, we've been talking about how the human error can cause the records not to be complete, but sometimes it's intentional.
Yeah.
To not make the records complete and accurate. You know, with the Tulsa race massacre that happened, they tried to frame it as a race riot.
Yes.
So that, you know, they wouldn't get insurance for the properties that were destroyed or their homes or things like that. So they were very careful in the way they phrased that, you know. So these oral histories in communities are oftentimes more factual than what you can find written. And it's not just because somebody made a mistake. Somebody intentionally did that, you know.
Yes, they knew exactly what they were doing. That's a really good point to bring up too. I know in Monica Muñoz's book, she talks about this trial in 1915. Let me see here. Did she cite it? There was a trial against the Texas Rangers in 1915, and they had a hard time getting testimony from the survivors of all that violence in order to like hold the Texas Rangers accountable for everything that they had done. And people that did kind of shed light on the actual incidents, but it still wasn't like enough to kind of get anything done or to see any justice. done in that case. So yeah, you're right about intentional mistakes and errors, or things being left out, gaps in narratives and stories, and sort of glossing over a lot of like really important details. And we still see that now. We still see that in injustices now, in racial violence in this country, the court cases. Oh, timer. Oven. Anyway, it's dinner time. Yeah, so that's also an interesting fact too, that the same patterns that we see from historical records, leaving all of that out, and the reason why we still feel these kind of wounds in our generational wounds still exist, is because those things still happen. There's still injustices where families don't see justice for violence committed or crimes committed against them. It's the same thing. It's still going on, and that's why I think this kind of study is so important. But again, the persistence is like, maybe not everybody travels to go visit archives and does like crazy archival research to preserve their family's history, but sometimes those histories can be preserved just with storytelling. Like I remember my grandma telling us stories about how she grew up, and that was insightful as a young person. I think I must have been in middle school, maybe in like 6th or 7th grade possibly, where my mom was kind of adamant about my grandmother kind of telling us how her and my grandfather grew up. They grew up in one-room shacks with dirt floors, and she was just trying to paint a picture of like the drastic difference in our life versus their life. And it really kind of put it into perspective for me in terms of how things have changed so much. I don't think I understood it fully back then, of course. But I'm grateful for that knowledge, though. I don't think a lot of folks get that perspective. And then also maybe comparing that to like how your schoolmates' families kind of grew up, and listening to stories of immigration from a variety of different countries. I just think that that's really important too. Does anyone else have kind of the same instances of family sharing of stories in their families that were shared over time?
I feel like there were a lot of things that went unsaid. So more often than not, I feel like for whatever reasons, right, things just kind of weren't talked about. And then through my own research, I've like been able to find information and then start asking questions to provoke those conversations. Like, for example, my grandmother came from a big family. I always knew that she had like 9 brothers and sisters. But what I found that I didn't know was that she actually came from a family of 13 children, but a few of those children died in childhood. And that was something that she never spoke to me about until I kind of found that information and started asking her questions. And I'm sure some of that is hard to talk about, or some of it maybe you just don't think is important when you're reflecting on your own life and what you share. But being able to like do research and ask questions helped to kind of unravel some of those family histories.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right about that, what's said versus also what goes unsaid. I remember finding or being shown a book it was a book on photography, and the photographer's name is totally escaping me. I'll remember it in a little bit, I think. But my friend Antonia Castañeda was putting together a presentation, and she asked me to like scan photos from this book, and man, but the photographer was photographing Mexican migrant families who were kind of living on the road and traveling from field to field all over the country, and just taking these really beautiful photographs of families in wagons and trucks with all their stuff kind of piled up and wrapped up, and just sort of documenting that that trajectory of people all over the country, and that diaspora of people all over the country, for farming and agricultural, labor. Man, the name is like right there and I can't get it. but I thought that was a really I forgot where I was going with that point, to be honest, but yeah, all of these documents, all of these different stories are told in a variety of different ways. Oh, that's where I was going. I showed my grandma a photo of a Mexican family living in Corpus Christi in like the 40s or the late 30s. And she was a child in that era. And I was like, is this, and then kind of putting together like the stories that she had told me when I was a kid about growing up in the dirt shack and living in the kind of housing that they lived in. Years later, I showed her one of those photographs and I was like, is this kind of what it looked like? I was really curious. And she was kind of like, not in denial, but she was like, oh no, my father would have never let that trash can be dumped over. He would have picked all of that up. He would have like put it up in the, put it up nicely. So there was like this like really strong sort of like a dignity in it, but also, I don't know if it was like a rejection of it, but yeah, she wasn't really like having it. She was like, no. But it was, I think, and now in the reality of it is definitely how they grew up when she was very, very small. So again, like what's said versus what's unsaid, and you can kind of read between the cues there, because it's different how people take in these experiences, how they process these experiences, and how they come out of them. So that's interesting too. I still can't remember the photographer's name, but now it's going to kill me. I was hoping to maybe point out a few things in some of the readings. Did anybody find anything, or was there something that stood out to you guys in some of the readings? I know Anna said she's already read the Caswell, but even in the Monica Muñoz Martinez one, they both kind of have their own way of talking about the importance of oral histories. I feel like they concentrate on it a little bit differently, but they're talking about two completely different histories, but their approach to it is different and the same at the same time. I don't know if anybody had anything stand out to them that they want to share.
What you were just saying about your grandmother kind of struck me, and in the reading when she's talking about let me see if I can find the line. A unique opportunity for studying the relationship between history, memory, and social relations of power. That struck me because I also had like conversation with my grandmother before she passed away, and I did the whole like ancestry thing. And as descendants of slaves, you can only go so far back in that. But my I think it's like my great grandmother was a product of a master and a slave on my mom's side. And my grandmother remembered the man that fathered this child, and he actually claimed the child, right? So it's this interesting, like, he would come over for dinner. She can remember him coming to visit, and all these different things. But it's weird because of that dynamic that created that connection, but in her mind, kind of like what you said about your grandmother, she switched it to be a like, oh, he loved this child, and he actually left her some land, which he did, but then the family ended up selling it. We didn't keep the land in the family because they valued the money more than they did the land. But in her mind, it she tried to take it and make it more of a fairy tale, And we don't know what the dynamics were. I doubt it was a love story, because as I went through the ancestry, I found that he had a wife and other children and all this kind of stuff, you know, because those records are clear. It's
Yeah.
easy to trace that lineage. Like that line, I was able to trace back to the British 300s or something, 1300s, you know, it's crazy. But my line stops at her, you know, and her mother. I could figure out her mother's name, but that was striking to me, that my grandmother had like a nickname for him. And you know, and it's just that I think that desire to take something awful and try to find the silver lining in it, and especially when it's your own story, and soften it, maybe, I don't know. So that really struck me with the reading, because even though it's an oral history, then it's susceptible to the weaknesses or the personalities that are telling that story.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a beautiful explanation of all the things that come along with an oral history, because it's not like the more like kind of scientific way that they portray these in these official documents. And I think a lot of folks might even criticize oral histories for being you know, too reliant on someone's memory and stuff like that. But when it comes to people of color's history, that's like the most crucial thing. It's like kind of all you have to really understand what's going on or what happened or where you came from. And there's lots of gaps. And even like you said, just complete like erasure after a certain period of people's lives. And it really has to do with race and power structures. And who was writing the story, who was reporting all of that. It's hard. It's really hard to find out where you came from and figure it out because of all of that. But again, there's that persistence. And that's why I think I was so struck by the book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, because it was so fascinating to me to hear all of these perspectives kind of tied into, like, she would use official documents and like the official court proceedings and all of that information, but she would fill in these gaps with the oral histories and these narratives and these families' experiences and things like that, which I just thought was fascinating, because it was just this, I mean, that's the first time, I'm not a historian or anything, but that was the first time I had ever seen a book be so comprehensive with a little bit of both. And yeah, it's very powerful, because it's like a certain kind of care, a certain level of care that families and individuals have to take to preserve these kinds of narratives, you know. And that's like that interview you did with your grandma, and her memory of that family and that part of the family is also crucial and critical. And I just think there's something like bittersweet about it, you know, definitely bittersweet. Yeah.
We have a raised hand.
Oh, yes, Anna, sorry, I didn't see that.
Oh, you're all good. Yeah, I was just gonna kind of speak on that point of, you know, the level of, you know, fallibility also in oral histories, and how they're also in a certain way kind of an interpretation of events, influenced by so many factors, you know, just people losing their memory and kind of like, yeah, wanting to paint things maybe in a certain way just because that's the best way you can digest the things that have happened to you, you know. And I've definitely witnessed that in my own family. And it can be kind of difficult to, you know, see a family member, especially a living family member, kind of in the practice of doing that. But it's also this thing of, you know, it's like, you really want to respect, like that's their story, that's their version of the story. And it's almost like, yeah, with drawing upon oral histories and official documents, so on, it's like you're kind of trying to approximate the truth, even though I don't think there really is a way to reach the truth. I mean, we can't like get in a time machine and then just like go observe an event, you know. All you can do is just take what you have. And yeah, I mean, I think though that there's something with oral histories that there's like a soul imbued in it, and really being able to observe someone kind of digesting their own perception of what they've been through, that really speaks to me. And being able to sometimes see them speak, if it's like a video interview, is another level of like, you know, them being embodied and talking about their experience, I just think is really courageous. And I'd say that like another aspect of like going back to kind of dealing with our own families' histories, is that like I think a lot of people, or particularly people who lie within the margins, they don't necessarily kind of look at their experiences sometimes as maybe like being worthy of preserving. And I think that that's where sometimes it's like, you know, it's like, well, what does my memory matter to anyone but me, right? And I really like would love to see that change more, is to see people as, you know, creating their present and their future, so that folks in the future can know about the past. But it's also like, you know, you can get kind of, I guess, obsessive if you're like trying to document your life in the present or something like that. So it's like, you know, trying to strike a balance between just living your life and like wanting to sort of, yeah, have certain things you can draw upon so you can share those experiences with, you know, people in your family or just whoever in the future might be interested in your record, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I like that aspect of like, well, first of all, yeah, the worthiness of a story. Like, there's probably folks who don't believe that their remembrance or their memory of something is important, but I think that it is. And certainly I think a lot of people do too. I know that there are a lot of efforts, like Story Corps is one really big one, and there's certain university archives that invite things like oral histories. In the Caswell study, there was somebody here who she quotes somebody in the SADA archive who says that they got so excited about the archive that they wanted to participate and volunteer and contribute, so that they had done an interview with their father about a year before their father had passed away. And then all of a sudden, after that passing, that one interview was like the only one that they had. And they were so grateful that they had that preserved, you know, in an archive, not just for them and their family, but for other people interested in the same history. I think collecting those memories are really special. And if someone's doing any particular kind of research, it becomes a super important document, and just another perspective of the many perspectives of something that happened. And also just like a proof that yes, this indeed happened, you know. So I think a lot of these, well, especially in Martinez's book, a lot of this history just completely went, you know, covered over and swept under the rug. And I think that's the real painful part that she's talking about, and she's coming from it from like that's why this is a important kind of document. This is like a healing process for these families. She talks about, she interviewed a woman, Miss Rodriguez, let's see, Norma Longoria Rodriguez, and she's in San Antonio. And she was a descendant of some of that racial violence. And she says that it's an injustice. It never leaves you. It's an inherited loss. And I believe that's where the title of the book came from. And it's very, very telling, because it is sort of like this open wound. And she was like in this search to uncover it. And even historians like Monica Muñoz Martinez, she's part of this larger group of scholars in an organization that they started called Refusing to Forget. And they petitioned the Texas Historical Commission to erect historical markers in different counties throughout the state that acknowledge these incidents in history that were that have been covered up for so long. And that's just like mind-blowing to me also, which is another reason why I just, I love the work that she's doing. She's an incredible historian. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention too that I know that in Dallas, there's a really awesome group called the Dallas Mexican American Historical League. And I think they did a exhibit over at the Latino Cultural Center in Dallas where they kind of crowdsourced from folks, family archives featuring photos of the neighborhoods they grew up in. And it was really impactful for me, even if I wasn't like a person who had kind of grown up in the Oak Cliff community. It just made me think about, potentially other elders who may have gone and seen that exhibit and seen, places that they'd been to in the past, and how that might help them with processing their own memories and being like, oh yeah, like I remember this ice cream shop and this and that. So I thought that was really cool to be able to, share these family memories so that people could sort of create this imagined community of the past.
Absolutely, because that's also brings in the aspect of inclusion and access, and also kind of changes the way we think about history. I mean, to be honest, when I was a kid, history was not my favorite subject. I think that it was like the teachers that made it really boring, or it was just like the state's version of it was like, it was more repetition. It was just like, you have to remember this so you can get it right on the tests and we can get funny. It was just like not, the emphasis was, the priority was not there. And so it was not my favorite subject. But then archives like these, exhibits like the one you're talking about, and organizations like the one in Dallas, or even here, there's an organization called SACAM. It's the San Antonio African American Community Archive Museum. And they also kind of collect the same thing, photographs, stories. They include like the African American history in San Antonio, and it's fascinating. And it's like, see, this is, I think, the type of content that I believe young people would be really interested in. I think it would totally change if this was included in curriculum, or at least in field trips, or something like that. I think that's what made the past more interesting to me as a kid, was when my grandmother was explaining it to me. I think that's a really, let's see, Jessica put a link here. Can I click on it?
Yeah, that's to OLA Tarrant County, which is Historians of Latino Americans. And it's, the same kind of, gathering of oral histories for Tarrant County, kind of focused on Latino American history here.
Awesome.
But yeah, I feel like the same for me as well. Like hearing history, learning about history in school was always so boring because of the lack of relevance. Like I didn't see myself connected to it. It just seemed like this really abstract thing that we had to learn. But bringing in kind of that personal relevance and understanding my history has like opened me up to being more interested in general history. And part of that happened for me in college, being able to take like very specific history classes, like history of America in the 1960s, or history of the American family, or these like very specific things that were much more interesting and engaging than just like, American history.
Yeah, exactly. That's super valid point. Absolutely. Jocelyn?
I feel like I was unique in that I had a couple of teachers. I grew up in Cuba, New Mexico, and I had 2 teachers that were really incredible in terms of incorporating local history into our curriculum. Like one of them had like a master's in folkloric studies or something like that. And the other one was just like very knowledgeable about local history and had ties to a lot of like local community leaders. And so we were able to learn a lot about history that was very relevant to us, and like folklore and that type of thing. So like, I remember when we learned about the cabezon, we learned about it from like the perspective of the Pueblo people and the Navajo people. And so it was, I went on to get an art history degree. That was what my undergrad was, but I just feel like that was something really special that a lot of people are missing, because it created a sense of like connectedness to where I was, and an interest in history, and an understanding of where I came from in a way that I don't think most people get. Like, I really think that I'm an outlier, because when I talk about, you know, these teachers and what we were learning, it's very different from like what other people are learning in school. And they didn't take, at that time, they were like, I'm an art teacher right now, and I see my curriculum, I am fortunate enough to create, but I see there's so much like canned curriculum going on in the schools, and then they had like teachers had a certain freedom, and so we were able to study cuentos, and then part of it would be like interviewing our family. So when I was in middle school, we had to choose an object, an old object from our family history, and write a report on it. And so I chose it was called a petaquilla. Are you all familiar with the? So basically it was like a chest, this huge chest that my grandmother's, it had been my grandmother's grandmother's, and her grandfather's family gave it to her when she married my great grandfather. And so it's really, really old. It's like from the 1880s. And so it was just an object that I had seen at my grandma's house like a million times. I crawled on top of it and, you know, looked into it. And I was able to like pull out like this history of like how like the marriage ritual, and how, you know, the exchange and that type of thing. And so so it was really interesting that I had teachers who were I feel very fortunate, who were able to incorporate oral histories and think about like objects and finding the stories through the objects. Yeah, so that's like been my experience. But then there's also like those hidden histories. Like my dad said that his great grandmother was un cautiva, and so, but a lot of our native history is just not there. It's missing, and it's missing intentionally. We don't know who our native ancestors were. Like that's one story my dad says, but he doesn't remember a lot about what was said or who she was or where she came from. Just that she was a captive from a tribe. And so, yeah. And so like those histories were intentionally, I think, part of like white supremacy is getting Latinos to only think about like one side of the equation when our genealogy is much more complicated, but we're disconnected culturally from our native ancestry. So
absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And to your point on like intentional gaps, intentional being left out. Same thing in our family too. I know my grandma and my mom were saying that on my grandfather's side, there was Native American Indians somewhere in there. And that's where the story stops. Like nobody knows any details. They don't know a name. They don't know where they came from. They don't even really know exactly. Like my mom was like, oh, I think it may have been like a marriage. Like they was like a married into a Native woman. I know it was a woman, but that's it. And I just feel so like, you know, that's just another part of our story that has been left out. And they just got lost over the decades, you know, got lost over the generations. And also just this, you know, like my grandmother's generations need to Americanize themselves and, you know, learn to speak English and go to school and, you know, get that whole progression from there. But in that progression, then all of like a lot of the past stuff gets a little lost. So it's again, it's like we benefited from the sacrifices, but we lost a lot of the history. And so maybe there's a little bit of us my generation trying to take that back, you know, you as well trying to like, and all of us doing this ancestral research, Letitia's research, Jessica's research, Earline's research and her beautiful work, you know, through regaining that knowledge and trying to pass it on. And I appreciate us visual artists like kind of doing that in all of our work. Jocelyn, you as well, putting bits and pieces of it into the work. And it makes me feel really good when somebody kind of recognizes like, oh, that reminds me of my grandma, or, oh, I recognize that symbol or that piece of fabric, or my grandma has a similar story or something like that, you know. It makes me feel good because it's like, yeah, there's a lot of things that connect us in those ways, you know. And so again, these types